Welcome to Dark Hour Tales. Tonight's tale is The Hiding Place. Jakub Lewin heard the vehicle before he saw its headlights, and the distant growl of the engine was enough to make him stop so abruptly that Marek almost walked into the back of him. For several seconds, the two boys stood completely still beside the narrow country road, listening as the engine grew louder somewhere beyond the bend. The November night was bitterly cold. Their clothes were damp from several days spent traveling through fields and woodland, and neither of them had eaten properly since the previous morning. Jakub's shoes had begun letting water through around the soles, while Marek had developed a cough that became noticeably worse whenever the temperature dropped. They had spent 3 nights avoiding villages, main roads, and any building that appeared occupied, moving mostly after dark and sleeping wherever they believed nobody would think to search. Jakub grabbed Marek's sleeve and pulled him toward the roadside ditch, where a narrow drainage channel disappeared beneath thick vegetation several meters away. They dropped into it and forced themselves underneath the tangled branches, pressing their bodies against freezing mud as the approaching engine became louder. Marek whispered that there was barely enough room for both of them, but Jakub told him they would have to make it enough, then pushed himself farther beneath the undergrowth until branches covered most of his coat. A few seconds later, headlights swept across the road and briefly illuminated the vegetation above their heads before a German military vehicle stopped almost directly beside them. Doors opened and boots struck the road. 2 men began speaking in German, too quietly for Jakub to understand more than an occasional word, and then he heard something that frightened him considerably more than the soldiers' voices. Somewhere beyond the ditch, a dog was panting. Marek shifted beside him, and when Jakub turned his head, he saw that his friend's face had gone pale. The cough that had troubled him throughout the previous night was returning, and Marek pressed both hands against his mouth in an attempt to suppress it. Jakub pulled the sleeve of his coat across Marek's face and held it there, trying to muffle any sound without making it impossible for him to breathe. The dog came closer until Jakub could hear its nails scraping against the edge of the road. It sniffed through the grass, pulled against its lead and moved towards the ditch, while one of the soldiers followed behind it. Jakub lowered his face toward the mud and tried to breathe as quietly as possible. Marek was trembling beside him, and the muscles in his chest tightened every few seconds as he fought against the cough. The soldiers' boots stopped close enough that Jakub could see them through a gap in the vegetation, and for one terrible moment, the dog pushed its nose between the branches above them. Jakub tightened his grip around Marek and waited for the animal to bark. Another engine approached along the road before the dog could force its way farther into the vegetation. One of the soldiers called towards the man beside the ditch, and after a brief reply, the soldier stepped away. The dog resisted and continued sniffing toward the boys until its lead tightened and dragged it back toward the road. Jakub heard another vehicle stop, followed by several voices and the sound of papers being handled. The patrol remained nearby for several minutes, and neither boy dared move, even when the cold mud began soaking through their clothes. Eventually, the doors slammed, both engines started, and the vehicles disappeared into the distance. Jakub waited long after the sound had gone before releasing Marek. His friend immediately rolled onto one side and coughed violently into his sleeve, his entire body shaking with the effort of keeping the noise down. When he finally recovered, Jakub told him in an angry whisper that he had nearly got them both killed. Marek wiped his mouth and replied that next time he would try to arrange his illness more conveniently, which earned him a furious stare from Jakub before the absurdity of the remark almost made both boys laugh. Neither allowed themselves to, and they remained hidden for another 20 minutes before climbing from the ditch and continuing along the dark road. 4 days earlier, both boys had still belonged to families who knew exactly where they were supposed to be after dark. Jakub was 16 and had spent much of his childhood helping his father in the small watch repair shop beneath their flat, where he had learned how to recognize good mechanisms, damaged springs, and the tiny differences between watches that appeared identical to everyone else. Marek was 15 and had spent most of his childhood announcing new plans for adulthood every few months. He had wanted to become a doctor, a footballer, a journalist, and for almost an entire year, a pilot, despite Jakub regularly reminding him that he became nervous whenever he climbed anything higher than a ladder. They had known one another since they were 6 years old. Marek's father referred to Jakub as his son's unpaid lawyer because Jakub was usually the person explaining why whatever trouble Marek had caused was not entirely his fault. Jakub's mother claimed Marek possessed an unnatural ability to appear at their house whenever dinner was being served, and she had long since stopped pretending she had not deliberately begun cooking enough for him. Those memories now seemed to belong to another life, because 4 days earlier, German forces and auxiliary police had sealed the streets of their neighborhood and begun forcing families from their homes. Jakub and Marek survived only because they had been away from their houses when the roundup began. They tried to return and reached a nearby street before seeing people being marched towards waiting vehicles. Jakub saw his mother once among the crowd, holding his younger sister close against her side while his father walked behind them. He could never be certain whether she saw him watching from the alley. Marek searched desperately for his own parents but never found them. A neighbor who had escaped through a back courtyard eventually dragged both boys away before their attempts to reach their families got them caught as well. The neighbor had given them the only plan they possessed. Somewhere in the countryside, 2 nights away, lived a farmer named Viktor Zielinski, who was said to shelter people temporarily and connect them with others who could move them farther east. The boys were told to say that Leon from Brzezinski had sent them, and Viktor would understand what they needed. Marek treated the information as something close to salvation, while Jakub regarded it as another possibility that might keep them alive if they were fortunate. By the following morning, they had reached the edge of a small village and hidden among trees overlooking several houses. Marek argued that they needed food badly enough to risk approaching someone, and Jakub was beginning to agree when a military truck entered the village and stopped outside one of the homes. A woman emerged with 2 young children while soldiers searched the building behind her. The boys could not hear what was being asked, but they saw enough to understand that entering the village would be reckless. Jakub pulled Marek back into the trees, and they continued without food. That afternoon, they found an abandoned agricultural shed far from the road and decided to rest until darkness returned. The roof leaked in several places and the floor smelled of wet straw, but the building gave them enough shelter to sleep without lying directly on frozen ground. Marek discovered a small Star of David scratched into one of the wooden walls, with 2 initials and a date from several weeks earlier carved beside it. He immediately took it as proof that other Jewish fugitives had traveled the same route, and told Jakub that perhaps those people had been heading towards Viktor's farmhouse as well. Jakub replied that the carving proved only that somebody had stood inside the shed, not that they had reached safety afterwards. Marek accused him of believing everything was a trap, while Jakub answered that everything had become dangerous enough to deserve suspicion. The disagreement lasted only a few minutes before Marek sat beside him and asked whether he remembered the football they had lost behind the synagogue when they were 10. Jakub reminded him that Marek had kicked it onto a roof, while Marek insisted that Jakub had dared him to try. Their argument over responsibility continued quietly until both boys were smiling, and for several minutes, the war existed somewhere beyond the leaking walls, while they remembered being children who had once believed losing a football was a serious problem. They slept until evening and continued traveling after dark. The farmhouse appeared shortly before midnight the following night, first as the outline of a roof beyond a low rise, and then as a cluster of dark agricultural buildings surrounding a small house. A faint yellow light showed behind one downstairs window. Marek stopped beside Jakub and whispered that they had finally found it, while Jakub studied the open ground between them and the farm for signs of movement. There were no vehicles, no soldiers, and nothing to suggest they had been followed, so the boys crossed the field and approached the door. Jakub knocked twice. Nothing happened for several seconds, and then the door opened only a few inches. A farmer stood behind it holding an oil lamp. He appeared to be around 60, although years of physical labor had left his face deeply lined and his posture slightly bent. His gray hair was cut short, and he examined the boys carefully before asking what they wanted. Jakub gave the phrase exactly as he had been instructed, telling him that Leon from Brzezinski had sent them. The farmer's expression changed immediately, and he opened the door far enough to pull them inside before locking it behind them. The man introduced himself as Viktor and asked whether anybody had seen them approaching. Jakub said they did not believe so, and Victor nodded before leading them into a small kitchen. He gave them bread while heating a pot of soup, then warned Marek not to eat too quickly when the boy began swallowing almost without chewing. Marek ignored the advice until he nearly choked, and Victor passed him water with the mildly irritated manner of an adult dealing with an impatient child. For the first 10 minutes, the farmhouse felt like the safest place either boy had entered since the roundup. Victor asked where they had come from and whether they knew what had happened to their families. Those questions seemed natural, but gradually his interest became more precise. He wanted to know exactly who had given them his name, whether Leon knew when they expected to arrive, whether anybody else knew where they were going, and whether anyone had seen them on the road. Jakub answered cautiously, while Marek appeared grateful simply to be sitting somewhere warm. Then Victor asked whether they carried money, documents, or jewelry. Marek produced the small amount of money he had left, but Jakub kept one hand inside his coat. Victor noticed and asked what he was carrying. Jakub told him it was only his father's broken watch. The glass had cracked during the roundup, and the mechanism no longer kept proper time, but it was the only possession from his family that remained with him. Victor explained that jewelry and expensive belongings could identify fugitives at checkpoints and might need to be exchanged for transport farther along the route. His explanation was reasonable enough that Marek accepted it immediately, although Jakub noticed that Victor continued looking towards the pocket containing the watch. Eventually, the farmer stood and explained that German patrols sometimes search properties in the district during the night. If the boys were going to remain until morning, they could not stay in the kitchen. Victor moved a heavy table, rolled back an old rug, and revealed a square wooden hatch beneath the floor. When he opened it, cold, stale air rose into the room. Marek glanced at Jakub, but Victor assured them that others had used the hiding place safely before, and that someone would hopefully arrive the following day to move them onward. The space beneath the floor was larger than Jakub expected, although it was barely high enough for them to sit upright. Rough wooden beams supported the kitchen above, while packed earth formed most of the walls. Several old blankets lay in one corner, beside empty food tins and a candle. Names had been scratched into the timber, some accompanied by dates, and somebody had drawn a crooked little house beneath one of the beams. Marek examined the carvings with visible relief and told Jakub that this was the proof he had wanted, because people really had hidden there before them. Marek found a bent nail beside the wall and began scratching their own names into the timber. When Jakub asked what he was doing, Marek explained that they could return when they were old men and proved they had once spent a night underneath a farmhouse. Jakub told him that nobody would voluntarily return to such a miserable hole, but Marek continued until he had carved Jakub Lewin, 1942, and Marek Rosen, 1942, beside one another. He placed the nail down with satisfaction and told Jakub that their future grandchildren could add their own names underneath if they wanted. Jakub was about to make another remark when something beside Marek's hand caught his attention. It was a wristwatch, partly hidden beneath an old blanket. Jakub picked it up and immediately recognized that it was valuable. His father had repaired similar watches, and although the strap was worn, the mechanism still worked. Jakub searched beneath the blanket and found several coins pressed into the earth. A small gold wedding ring lay near the wall, followed by a silver chain, a pair of spectacles in a hard case, and a child's pendant tucked beneath another piece of cloth. Marek suggested that people might have dropped things while hiding, but Jakub continued searching until the number of possessions made that explanation impossible. People fleeing for their lives might abandon clothing, food, or luggage, but a married woman who had reached safety would not simply leave her wedding ring beneath the floor, and somebody carrying a valuable watch across occupied territory would not forget it beside a blanket. Jakub held the ring in his palm and asked Marek why nobody had returned for any of these belongings. Marek looked towards the hatch above them and did not answer. An engine approached the farmhouse before either boy could decide what to do. Footsteps crossed the kitchen, and the table above them scraped against the floor. Victor opened the hatch just far enough for his face to appear and told them to remain completely silent. The boys expected fear in his voice, but the farmer sounded calm. He closed the hatch again, moved the table back into place, and walked away as another vehicle stopped outside. The farmhouse door opened and several men entered. Heavy boots crossed the kitchen directly above the hiding space, causing dust to drift between the floorboards and settle in Marek's hair. A soldier asked, "Alles ruhig?" And Victor answered, "Ja," with none of the nervousness Jakub expected from a man secretly hiding two Jewish boys beneath his kitchen. Another soldier entered, and something heavy that sounded like a rifle was placed against a piece of furniture. Jakub could see fragments of movement through the narrow gaps between the boards, including black boots, trouser legs, and the lower edge of a chair. One soldier stopped directly above Marek. The wooden board bent slightly beneath his weight, and Marek pressed himself against the earth wall as though he could somehow make his body smaller. Jakub watched the boots through the gap and imagined the soldier hearing their breathing beneath him. The man remained there long enough for Jakub's muscles to begin aching from the effort of remaining completely still. But eventually he moved towards the table. Then Victor poured drinks. The sound disturbed Jakub more than the soldier's arrival had. Glasses touched the tabletop, chairs scraped across the floor, and somebody laughed at a remark Jakub could not understand. Another soldier addressed Victor by his first name, and Victor replied with the ease of someone speaking to familiar visitors. These men were not searching the farmhouse. They were comfortable inside it. A glass tipped somewhere above, and several drops of liquid passed through the floorboards before landing in the earth beside Jakub's hand. Marek slowly turned his head towards him, and Jakub could see that his friend had reached the same conclusion. Before either boy could whisper, one of the soldiers asked, "Wo sind sie?" Jakub understood enough German to know what the man had asked. "Where are they?" Victor replied quietly and told him to wait. A few moments later, Jakub heard Victor mention two boys. Another question followed, then the unmistakable sound of coins being counted onto wood. Jakub had heard his father count money across the watch shop counter almost every evening of his childhood, and he recognized the sound immediately. The possessions hidden beneath the floor suddenly made perfect sense. Victor was not part of an escape route. He allowed fugitives into his house, fed them enough to gain their trust, and placed them beneath the floor, where he could keep them until the occupation authorities arrived. The watches, rings, jewelry, and other belongings had been taken from people who believed they had finally reached safety. Whether Victor sold them before or after the arrest no longer mattered. Every scratched name surrounding Jakub and Marek belonged to somebody who had trusted the same man. Jakub began feeling along the earth wall while Marek listened to the conversation above. They had only minutes, perhaps less, before Victor moved the table and opened the hatch. Marek whispered that there was nowhere to go, but Jakub ignored him and pushed at every loose board he could reach. One piece of timber shifted beneath his hand, and when he pulled it away, cold air touched his fingers. Behind the board was a narrow passage somebody had dug through the earth. The tunnel was scarcely wide enough for Marek's shoulders and appeared partially collapsed several feet inside, but remaining beneath the floor meant certain capture. Marek entered first because he was smaller, lowering himself onto his stomach and crawling forward using his elbows, while Jakub followed. Packed earth pressed against Jakub's shoulders and prevented him from lifting his head properly. Behind them, furniture scraped across the kitchen floor. The hatch opened. A soldier shouted when he discovered the hiding place empty. Marek crawled faster, dragging himself through the passage while loose soil fell around his face. Jakub followed closely enough to feel the soles of his friend's shoes against his hands. Suddenly, Marek stopped. He whispered that he was stuck, and Jakub pushed against his feet while Marek clawed at the soil ahead. Part of the tunnel had collapsed around his shoulders, leaving barely enough space to move. Voices entered the hiding place behind them. Someone had discovered the loose board. Jakub pushed harder against Marek's shoes, and Marek forced himself forward until the earth around his shoulders gave way. Cold night air entered the tunnel. Marek dragged himself through the opening, and Jakub followed seconds later, emerging beneath the raised floor of an old timber shed behind the farmhouse. They crawled through weeds and broken boards until they were outside. A shout came from the house before they had crossed half the yard. The boys ran towards the distant tree line. Their legs were already exhausted from days of traveling, but fear drove them across the field while voices followed from behind. A gunshot cracked through the darkness, and Jakub instinctively lowered his head without slowing. Another shot struck somewhere in the ground nearby, sending dirt into the air, while Marek remained beside him and urged him towards a low stone boundary ahead. They scrambled over the wall and landed badly on the other side. Beyond it lay another stretch of exposed field before the woods. Jakub's breathing had become painful, and his legs no longer seemed capable of carrying him at the speed he needed. Marek began pulling ahead before noticing that Jakub was falling behind, and he slowed despite Jakub repeatedly telling him to keep running. The soldiers were gaining. Their voices sounded closer, and another shot passed somewhere to Jakub's left. Marek looked towards the woods and then towards an old agricultural building standing away from their escape route. Jakub recognized the decision forming on his friend's face and grabbed his coat before he could move. Marek pulled himself free and told Jakub to keep going toward the trees. Jakub refused and reached for him again, but Marek stepped away. For most of their journey, Jakub had been the one making decisions, finding hiding places and warning Marek when his optimism became dangerous. Now Marek looked at him with an expression Jakub had never seen before, and he told his friend that if they stayed together, neither of them was going to reach the woods. Marek turned and ran towards the agricultural building. Jakub called after him, but Marek did not stop. He reached a pile of rusting equipment beside the wall and deliberately kicked over a metal container. The crash carried across the open field, immediately drawing shouts from the soldiers behind them. Marek disappeared around the side of the building, and the pursuit changed direction. Jakub stood frozen for several seconds, unable to make his body move towards the trees. He wanted to follow Marek, even though he understood exactly why his friend had drawn the soldiers away. Then he remembered the roadside ditch and Marek fighting against his cough, the miserable agricultural shed where they had argued about a lost football, and Marek carving both of their names into the timber beneath the farmhouse because he genuinely believed they would return together when they were old. Jakub turned towards the woods and ran. Branches struck his face as he entered the trees, but he continued until the farmhouse disappeared completely behind him. He eventually collapsed behind a fallen trunk and listened to the distant voices carrying across the field. Several minutes later, gunfire sounded near the agricultural building. Jakub could not tell exactly how many shots were fired, and he spent the rest of the night convincing himself that gunfire did not necessarily mean Marek had been hit. He remained hidden until dawn. Every movement among the trees made him lift his head because some part of him expected Marek to appear, filthy and exhausted, before complaining that Jakub had run too slowly. Jakub waited long after daylight reached the woods, but his friend never came. Jakub survived the war, although the details of that survival became complicated enough to fill the rest of his life. He eventually reached people who genuinely helped him, traveled under false papers, and remained hidden until liberation. Afterwards, he learned that his parents and younger sister had been murdered. He searched for information about Marek and his family, but found no official record explaining what happened to his friend after the night at the farmhouse. For most of his life, Jakub allowed himself one small uncertainty. He understood what the gunshots probably meant, but because he had not seen Marek die, he could never force himself to believe there was absolutely no possibility that his friend had escaped. Perhaps Marek had hidden inside the building. Perhaps the soldiers had fired at him and missed. Perhaps somebody had found him afterwards. The hope became less reasonable with every passing year, but Jakub never entirely surrendered it. He married after the war and eventually had children and grandchildren. He became an engineer rather than a watchmaker, although his father's damaged watch remained in his possession for the rest of his life. He rarely spoke about Victor's farmhouse, and when he did discuss the war with his family, he preferred telling them about Marek before everything changed. He described the boy who stole food from his mother's kitchen, argued passionately about football, and once announced that he would become a pilot despite being frightened of heights. More than 60 years after the night they escaped beneath the floor, Jakub returned to Poland. Victor's farmhouse had been abandoned for years. Part of the roof had collapsed. Vegetation covered most of the yard, and several outbuildings no longer stood. Jakub walked slowly through what remained of the kitchen, recognizing almost nothing until he found the damaged section of floor where the table had once stood. The hatch was still there. Jakub climbed carefully into the hiding space. The earth smelled damp, and much of the timber had begun to rot, but dozens of scratched names remained visible along the beams. Some belonged to people Jakub had never known, people who had reached Wiktor's farmhouse believing they had found a place of safety before being betrayed. He searched until he found two names carved beside one another. Jakub Lewin, 1942, Marek Rosen, 1942. Jakub rested his fingers against Marek's name and remained there for a long time. He did not think about Wiktor, the soldiers, or the gunshots beyond the woods. Instead, he remembered an 11-year-old Marek stealing apples from his mother's kitchen and insisting that Jakub had encouraged him. He remembered schoolyard arguments, football matches, and the ridiculous collection of careers Marek had intended to pursue. Most of all, he remembered a 15-year-old boy sitting beneath a farmhouse in occupied Poland and carving their names into a wooden beam because he still believed they would both live long enough to return. Jakub removed a small knife from his pocket and placed the blade beneath Marek's name. His hand was no longer as steady as it had been when he was 16, and it took him several minutes to carve the words clearly into the old timber. When he finished, he brushed the loose wood away with his fingertips and read the message he had left beneath the name of the friend who had given him the chance to grow old. It read, "I remembered.